right, thank you, Randy, and good evening. Good to see everybody. I know you've had a blessed day. I'm just going to count on that, right? Don't have to ask if you did. I'm just going to count on the fact that you did have a blessed day. Amen. And I want to remind everybody as we get started, before I get too far in, I want to remind everybody that this coming Sunday that we will have our outdoor service. We'll be up there in the chapel by the woods, so be sure and bring your lawn chair, probably a jacket, a throw or something, that sort of thing. Might be a little bit cool. Don't think it's going to be quite as cool as last Sunday, but it's going to be a good day. We're looking forward to it. Me and Miguel are going to be tag team preaching, and that'll be interesting. Since we're going to be doing a tag team, I need to come up with a name for us, The Scuffling Redneck and Mexican. We'll come up with something, whether it's right or wrong. There you go, Satan Slayers. There you go. All right, take your Bibles if you would, and let's look into Judges chapter number 14. I appreciate Ron Fuquay standing in for me last week while I was working through all the plumbing and sewer conundrums that we had going on at our house last week, and certainly glad to see that resolved. And I'm much rather be here doing this than what I was doing this time last week, so it's all good. But I appreciate Ron filling in for me last week. So 2 weeks ago, as we were making our way through Judges, and we started out in our first chapter of dealing with Samson, primarily laying the groundwork and the introduction of his parents, his father, his mother, the no-name lady. I've had that conversation with several people in the last week or so about Samson's mother, and we don't know what her name is. She's either Manoah's wife, the woman, or Samson's mother. But then I would go on and tell people about what I found, about what the rabbis had to say, that she was probably a godly woman, but her husband was a buffoon or whatever it was, and people just get cracked up with that, and I kind of find that interesting. But the interesting thing, I pointed out, that as you keep going through the chapter 13, you come to find out more and more that that's probably true about him. He wasn't connecting all the dots. So we come to chapter number 14, all right? And so we really get into the life and the work, I should clarify that, the very interesting life and work of Samson as a judge of Israel. And so a lot of that is borne out early on, very quickly. We've talked about this 2 weeks ago, about some of the contradictory things about Samson, the potential of what he could have been if he had just somehow gotten his heart and his head and his focus together. But we're going to see where a lot of those weaknesses were. But here's the thing, is that God still used Samson regardless. Not because Samson deserved it, nor do any of us. Not because he had any especially close walk with God, but because God had chosen to use him and gifted him for the sake of Israel. You got to remember something, that the story is bigger than just Samson. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, Samson is a great reminder that God can still shoot straight with a crooked arrow. Okay? So we get into that with Samson this evening. So in verses 1 through 4, so the first thing that we are introduced to is that Samson chooses a wife. And as we are going to see as this unfolds, there's not a lot of good thought put into this relationship that he pursues, okay? We begin at verse number 1. It says, "Now Samson went down to Timnah." Now, last week, I'd shown you where there in the lower portion of Dan, where he was born, where he finds his wife is not very far away from there. So you read this statement, says he went down to Timnah. Well, he didn't have to go very far, okay? Probably about 5 miles or so away from his home. One of the interesting things is that where he goes to, here's our map right here. So just kind of real quick. So Zorah and Eshtaol, this is the area that we concentrated on 2 weeks ago, where he was born, where he grew up, where he started, I guess maybe discovering the fact that some events going on where he was beginning to discover his strength, his great gift that God had given him. So that's where he was. Timnah, which was just referred to, is right here. So it's just down the road a little bit, probably about 5 miles. That's how far. But the interesting thing is that they're oppressed by the Philistines. And so there are Philistines that are in that area, that close to his home. Now you got to remember, the reason for that is it goes all the way back to the days of Joshua. When they were settling the land, God told them, get the Canaanites, all these original nations and tribes, get them out of here, drive them out. But they didn't. So you got all throughout Israel, you got all these pockets. And so you've got the Philistines there, all right? And not only there, but in other places as well. So he goes down to Timnah, and he saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and he told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife. Now I said at the outset, there's not a whole lot of thought that goes into this relationship, this marriage. He sees this woman, she catches his eye, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. He decides, I want to marry her, all right? So he goes to his parents, says, hey, I've seen this woman, get her. Now, the reason being is that day and age, parents were oftentimes the intermediaries. Marriages were typically planned, except that Samson's doing like he does with a lot of things. He's turning it all upside down and backwards. And so he says, take her, I want her as a wife. And you know, some, I've been reading, some say, well, maybe this was love at first sight. And I'll be honest with you. I think it was more a case of lust at first sight than it was anything else, if you want to know the honest truth, okay? Not a lot of thought, but there was a lot of lust going on, okay? Verse 3, then his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Now, you know, some of us as parents can appreciate that situation there. Now, first of all, you're dealing with a Jewish family. Philistines, by the way, are the oppressors at this particular time over Israel. They're the ones that Israel needs to be delivered from. So here's Samson. I want to marry this Philistine woman. Plus, she is from a pagan family. All right? And so these parents are deeply concerned on many levels for good reason. And they're kind of like, what are you thinking? Well, he's not thinking. It's not the first time that parents have had to say something to their children when their children came home and said, well, me and him are getting married, or me and her are getting married, and some parents are saying like, let's talk about this. Not the first time it's happened. And so you got a situation, I think, here's what I think the parents were doing. There were a number of issues, but I thought they saw a train wreck coming. And guess what? They were right. There was a train wreck coming. God was going to use it. On top of that, it's a case of being unequally yoked, which we'll talk about too in just a few minutes. So I made a comment just a moment ago that he has seen this woman. Okay, that's all he's done. He's basically seen her. Doesn't know her. I'm not sure if he even knows her name at this time. And so the parents say, hey, what are you thinking? And then in the latter part of verse number 3, it goes on and says, and Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she pleases me well. Now here's an interesting thing. This is the reason why I say this was not a well thought out thing. There was more lust here than there was love going on. The term, the word, she pleases me well, literally means she is right in my eyes. All he's doing is basing his judgment upon what he said. I'm sure she was a beauty, okay? But she is right in my eyes. In some ways today, some people might say she's eye candy. That's basically what it amounts to, okay? Interesting thing, that here Samson is the judge of Israel at this time, who has seen this Philistine woman. She has caught his eye, and he wants to marry her because it's right in his eyes. Okay? She is right in my eyes. That is very similar. It's not very far from where we find Israel at the end of the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 21, verse 25, it says, in those days there was not a king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So it's just interesting that you see that being reflected so clearly here in this man who is supposed to be the deliverer, and yet he is suffering from the same thing that the entire nation suffers from. And yet God's still going to use him to help deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. So his parents' objection was on solid ground, not only as Jews being oppressed by the Philistines and so forth. Here's the thing, they understood that God had commanded the Israelites not to intermarry with the people of the land. Now, can anybody imagine a reason why God would command Israel not to intermarry with the pagan people of the land? What was the purpose of it? Do what? They would influence them. Yeah, the influence. There's not shared values there. And it's what we call being unequally yoked. I mean, the scripture makes it very clear. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse number 14, Paul talks about that. Don't be unequally yoked. A believer should not marry a non-believer. What does light have to do with darkness? What does Satan have to do with Jesus? It's incompatible, not the same values. So don't marry someone who does not share your faith and values. People shouldn't even date someone who's a non-believer. Because here's the problem. You can be dating somebody like that and still find yourself falling in love, if that's the term you want to use or whatever, and end up getting married. And oftentimes, and it tends to many times be Christian young women who fall into this trap. Oh, he loves me and I just know that I can influence him for Jesus. Well, let me tell you something. Marriage is not intended to be a missionary endeavor. You're to marry someone who is of like faith. In fact, I go so far as even saying this. I think that even within the context of Christianity, I think you need to be careful about marrying somebody else. Young people or whatever age need to be careful about marrying someone else who is not of the same tradition as they are. I just here just a few weeks ago got a phone call from a young man who I know very well, and I've led him to the Lord and baptized him back a few years ago, and he's been dating a young woman, and come find out she's Catholic. And I've met her. She's a sweet young lady, but he calls me up and he says, hey, I need to talk to you about some things. I'm thinking about asking her to marry me. And he says, you understand all this stuff better than I do. He said, tell me, what do you think? What are the concerns? Well, he opened the door, okay? And so I just proceeded to begin to tell him they're myriad. The concerns are myriad. I mean, to start out with, in that kind of a situation, what you have is you have someone who comes from a tradition who their doctrinal background, just on the very nature of salvation, is totally different. In the Catholic Church, everything, listen, here's what people, in the Catholic Church, it's not about biblical teaching, it's about church tradition. That's the authority. And salvation is not about salvation by grace through faith in Jesus. They might use that terminology, but the reality is it's about sacraments. It's sacramental salvation. You have to keep the sacraments because the Catholic Church is the dispenser of salvation, and they do that through the sacraments. And you keep the sacraments, therefore you get a little bit of your salvation you're working towards. And then even then, when you die, you don't know for sure you're going to heaven, you know? And I said, and then yet here as Baptists, we focus on biblical tradition, biblical teaching, and salvation is grace by faith in Jesus plus and minus nothing. I said, just at the outset, you're looking at major issues. And I said, that does, and then there's many other things besides that doctrinally. And I said, and then someday you're going to have children. And then you're in a debacle, okay? Which tradition, which way are the kids going to be raised? That's why I say, don't even be unequally yoked with somebody else who professes to be a Christian. And I'm not judging that person's salvation. That's not my place. But I'm saying that the tradition is so very different that it's a setup for trouble. So just don't go there. Now, back to Samson, okay? Here's something I want to say about Samson real quick. Now, I probably said this a couple of weeks ago, and I'll probably say it again. You know, Samson is probably one of the best illustrations of a carnal Christian that you'll ever find in the Bible. You say, what is a carnal Christian? A carnal Christian is somebody who is directed in their life not by biblical values, but by personal, sensual, worldly, temporary values. So a carnal Christian is somebody who has accepted Christ as their Lord and Savior, but they've not matured in their faith and they've not learned how to live their life based upon a biblical worldview. They've not become a mature disciple and follower of Jesus, and so they're basically still making decisions the same way that they did before they got saved. You see that so very clearly in Samson, which is obvious in the verses that follow. Look at verse number 4. It says, but his father and mother did not know that this was of the Lord, and that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. And I say all that because in spite of the fact that Samson is a carnal man, that's the only way you can really describe him, a carnal, sensual man, all right? The only reason why God's using him is because God has a bigger purpose than it's not just about Samson, it's about God using him to help Israel, okay? And so his mother and father didn't realize, here's the reason why God's allowing this path to come together of marrying this woman. God was going to use it as an opportunity to take out some Philistines. That's basically what it was. And to help lead eventually to Israel being delivered from the oppression which they were under at the hand of the Philistines. So ultimately some good, I guess you can say, comes out of this marriage that was not necessarily an ideal marriage, and the fact that God was going to use it to begin eliminating some of the oppressors of Israel. But none of that, remember, none of that justified what Samson is doing. There's a sense in which Samson was determined to go down a certain path. And you know what? Here's one of the things I've learned in my own life and in watching and observing the lives of others. If somebody sets their mind, say a child of God sets their mind that they're going to go on a certain path, and it's not an ideal path that God would have them on, guess what God's going to let them do? He's going to let them go. He's going to let them go right on down that path, even knowing the failure, the heartache, the pain, the tragedy. He's going to let them go on down that path. Now, sometimes, and even though they may be acting in a way contrary, just like with Samson, but yet God still used Samson, because you got to remember something. The story's not really about Samson. The story is about how God is working on behalf of his people, even if he has to use a dull, misguided tool like Samson. It's because God cared for his people. By the way, it's kind of like the same situation when Jesus was crucified. Think about that, all right? Think about those individuals The crowd outside Pilate's palace crying, "Crucify him and give us Barabbas." And Jesus is turned over to the Romans, and the Romans take him and they beat him and so forth, and they scourge him, and they nail him to the cross. Those people were doing things of their own choosing, right? And God allowed them to do that, right? They were making the most awful choice that anybody could have ever made. Think about that. They were doing the worst thing anybody could do, nailing the Son of God to cross. And while all of that was totally wrong on their part, guess what? At the same time, God used it, didn't he? And also at the same time, those men were held accountable for the choices that they make. So you see kind of the same thing going on with Samson. There's this interesting thing about how God's sovereign plan moves along a plane similar to what's playing out down here on this earth. And even while things down here are not consistent with his ideal plan and ways, God still has a way of using it ultimately for his good. That's why he's God. He's sovereign, right? So then we come to verses 5 through 9. We see where Samson, he breaks the Nazirite vow. In verse number 5 it says, "So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah." Now, let me ask you a question. What do you see as a problem in that verse right there as it pertains to the Nazirite vow? Vineyards. Yeah. By the way, sometimes say, well, that Nazirites weren't supposed to drink wine. No, they weren't even supposed to use grape products at all. Okay? Now, we're not told that he did, but it's just kind of interesting that here he is there. If he's there, you kind of got an idea what's going on. He's at least picking grapes, all right? Then he goes on and says, Now to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. Now, interesting. Now, here's this guy. We know he's carnal. And all of a sudden, God's Spirit and power comes upon him. Well, why? There's a lion. And God gives him the power to kill that lion. Why? Think about if God had not given him the power to kill the lion, how might the scenario have gone? Yeah. And remember, Samson is the tool. Even though he is a flawed tool, he is the tool in the hand of God. So God is protecting his tool. And so he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat. I've never done that, so I don't know how you would, but I don't want to go there, all right? Though he had nothing in his hand, but he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Now, the only thing I can figure, and this becomes even more clear, is that having killed it, although, stay alive, but remember, what was the Nazirite not to do? Not to touch a dead body or carcass. Now, that becomes more clear as we go along. Verse 7. Then he went down and he talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. And after some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees were in the carcass of the lion. And he took some of it in his hands and went along eating. So here he is, this Nazirite. He's not to even touch a carcass, and he's reaching in and he's grabbing honey out of this dead carcass and eating it. And then goes home to share some with mama and daddy, all right? I find this interesting. He was on his way to go see that woman, okay? Because he returned to get her, but he sees this lion and he eats the honey. He must have forgot her, and he goes back home to share honey with his mom and dad. He doesn't say he went to see her. It's kind of interesting. So he took some of his hand and he went along eating, and when he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them. They also ate, but he did not tell them he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So why would he not tell his mother and father that? Well, they probably, you got to wonder too, some issue about uncleanness as a Jew. So in a sense, By giving his mother and father this honey out of this carcass of a lion, he's making them unclean, but he has violently violated the Nazirite vow, which, remember, his mother observed from the day, even before she conceived him and throughout pregnancy, she observed that Nazirite vow so that he would be a Nazirite even from the womb, okay? And so I came across this statement right here, and this kind of comes back to this contradictory stuff about Samson and his carnality. Somebody said this: Samson had consecration, or at least the appearance of it. He was consecrated as a Nazirite without communion. Consecration without communion. This was only good for the sake of image. The empty nature of his consecration would eventually be evident. His spiritual character and integrity were lacking. There's nothing in here that even tells us anything at all about him, except towards the end of his life, about him really calling out to God, seeking the Lord, and so forth. Consecration without communion. So, all right, verses 10 through 11, we come to Samson's feast and riddle. It says, so his father went down to the woman to work out arrangements for the marriage. And Samson gave a feast there, for young men used to do so. And it happened that when they saw him, that they brought 30 companions to be with him. And the terminology that talks about he gave a feast there, in the Hebrew, it literally means a drinking feast. Okay? So there again, you have a Nazirite, and he's at a bachelor party, and they're drinking heavily. All right? Verse 12, then Samson said to them, let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. Now, there's a strategy to his thinking here with this riddle and this wager. All right, so what's his strategy? What's he planning on doing? What's his strategy? Any idea? Well, his strategy is this. I'm going to give them a riddle they can't solve, and I'm going to make a wager, and I'm going to go away with 30 suits of new clothes. That's what his strategy is, all right? And they said, pose your riddle that we may hear it. And so he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. Now here's something I want to say about Samson, because he is kind of a contradictory sort of guy. He's one of these guys, he comes up with these riddles. And one of the things you learn about Samson is he's really a sharp guy. He's got a good mind. He's intelligent. But you know what he uses his intelligence on, or what he wastes it on? Foolishness and games. How many people do you know that are like that? People who God has just given them a tremendous mind and great intellect, but it's like they just completely waste it. It's just sad. Verse 15. But it came to pass on the 7th day that they, that is these 30 men, said to Samson's wife, so now a wedding has transpired, she's his wife now, okay? Entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Now, what kind of people would you say these guys are? Ruthless, okay? Or at least they're pretending to be ruthless anyway. Have you, now notice this, they bring her into the equation. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? In other words, they're accusing her of being a part of Samson's game. Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, "You only hate me, you do not love me, you have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me." So now the waterworks get turned on, okay? And he said to her, "Look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you?" Now don't forget that statement. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes, okay? Now she had wept on him 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the 7th day that he told her, because she pressed him so much. And then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, they came back with the answer to the riddle: "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, he knew where this came from. And I've always loved this line. If you had not plowed with my heifer, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Now, guys, let me just tell you, that ain't a good word to use about your wife. And now here's the thing. It was a proverb that he's using here to express his anger. That's the point, all right? But still not a good word to use to describe your wife, okay? But he was upset because he knows what's going on. They had manipulated her to get her to manipulate him. He knew what was up. There again, he's a sharp guy. He figures this stuff out. He puts the dots together, okay? Now, I want to say something right here for just a minute. I said, remember that line up there that Samson said when she said, "Tell me the riddle." And he says, "I've not told it to my mother and my father, and so would I explain it to you? Should I explain it to you?" Now, I want us to stop and talk just a minute right here, okay? There's an important principle that comes out of this text right here about marriage, okay? And it is this: marriage is to be a team where both are all in for each other, not just two individuals playing for the spotlight for themselves. Unfortunately, that's the kind of marriage that they had, which it's kind of, the way it all came together, you kind of figure and expect that sort of thing, all right? And so when he said, "I've not even told my mother and father, so should I explain it to you?" Boy, that is really backwards. I mean, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 says, "A man shall leave his mother and father and cleave only unto his wife." I'm one of the philosophy that when you get married, your wife comes before everybody else except the Lord. And vice versa. When a woman gets married, her husband becomes everybody else. Until the kids come along. So he puts his mother and father before his wife. But then notice that she allows herself to be manipulated and to betray her husband when what she should have, and she does it to protect her family and everything. What she should have done is she should have gone to her husband and said, "Here's what's going on." I mean, after all, he is Samson. He can kill all of them, all right? He can take them out. So that's just an important thing about the marriage. She put her family ahead of him, absolutely. They both did the same thing. And I'm telling you, I see that in marriages with young people, especially early on, but sometimes it just goes on and on and on. And as a pastor, I have seen so many situations where young couples marry, and it's obvious to me that the apron strings have not been cut. It's not good. So then we come to the end of the chapter in Samson's anger and revenge in verses 19 through 20. There again, here it is. Notice, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, not to avenge a husband's hurt feelings, but to deal with, ultimately, some of the oppressors. And it's interesting how this plays out. Because remember, in Judges 14:4, the Lord is looking for opportunity occasion to move against the Philistines, the oppressors. So the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. Now, he doesn't take out the 30 guys that manipulate his wife. This is interesting. Here's what he does. He goes down to Ashkelon, another town, another city. He takes out 30 guys there. Now, you say, well, why? Here's what I suppose was going on. I suppose that they likely were warriors who were a part of the oppression of Israel. And so he goes and he takes them out and he plunders them. He takes 30 suits of clothing from them. Now, here's the one place where you could say that Samson was a man of his word. He takes those 30 suits that he took from the Philistines that he killed in Ashkelon and pays off the 30 dudes that manipulated his wife on the wager. They figured out the wager. He paid his wager. And then the latter part of the verse says, and so his anger was aroused, and he went back to his father's house. You can figure the marriage was over, right? And Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. That's some kind of best man, isn't it? I'll close with this right here. Charles Spurgeon, and I keep coming back to this about Samson. Samson himself is a riddle. He was not only a riddle maker, but he was himself an enigma and very difficult to explain. And I would have to agree with that. All right, any questions? Any thoughts, Don? Yes. Yeah. And the bigger objective in God's plan, like I said, was not really about Samson. It was about his glory and about delivering his people. All right, anyone else? All right, those online, thank you for joining us. Have a blessed evening. Thank you. All right, and I will turn it over to Brother Randy.